In the early 1920s, the Bavarian countryside was a quiet and remote place, still recovering from the scars of World War I. Tucked deep within the woods and fields near the small town of Groburn stood a lonely farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It was not an easy home to find. Visitors had to travel dirt paths that disappeared into dense forest where shadows lingered long after the sun had set. The farm belonged to the Gruber family, who were not well loved by their neighbors but were known for their hard work and self-sufficient lifestyle. From the outside, Hinterkaifeck looked like any other Bavarian farm: fields for crops, pens for livestock, and a sturdy farmhouse. But to those who lived nearby, there was always something unsettling about this place, a sense of unease that seemed to cling to its walls long before tragedy struck. The family consisted of 6 members. At the head was Andreas Gruber, a man in his early 60s, known for his harsh, domineering personality. He had a reputation for being unfriendly, even cruel at times, and his relationship with the villagers of Groburn was strained. His wife, Cecilia, was quieter and more reserved, but she was said to live under Andreas's controlling shadow. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was a widow in her mid-30s who had lost her husband during the war. She lived on the farm with her 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Josef. The household was rounded out by the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only recently arrived at Hinterkaifeck to replace the former servant who had abruptly left, claiming the farm was haunted by strange occurrences. These 6 people, isolated in the countryside, would become the center of one of Germany's most infamous unsolved murder mysteries. Life at Hinterkaifeck was not easy. The farm was isolated by design. Neighbors lived far away, and visits were rare. This isolation made the family self-sufficient, but it also meant that when something went wrong, there was no one close by to help. Stories spread among the villagers about strange happenings on the farm. In the weeks leading up to March 1922, Andreas reported hearing footsteps in the attic, though he found no sign of an intruder. He also discovered unfamiliar footprints in the snow that led directly to the farmhouse, but none that led away. Tools from the shed went missing, and the family's newspaper delivery vanished mysteriously. These unsettling events painted a picture of a household under quiet siege, though whether it was by a human intruder or something less tangible, no one could say. The family told some neighbors of their fears, but Andreas, stubborn and proud, refused to alert the police. It is chilling to look back and realize how many warning signs there were before the tragedy. The former maid's abrupt departure was one of the most unsettling. She insisted the house was creaking with whispers and that she felt an unseen presence watching her. Though people might dismiss such talk as superstition, her fear was enough to convince her never to return. Even Victoria, known to be more open and sociable than her parents, confided to others that she felt the farm was not safe. Yet, despite the ominous atmosphere, daily life continued. Andreas tended to the fields, Victoria cared for her children, and Cecilia ran the household. To any passerby, the Grubers' life looked harsh but ordinary. But inside, they were already living under the shadow of something sinister. The family itself carried dark secrets, which further isolated them from the community. Andreas Gruber was rumored to have an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria, something that had even led to legal troubles years earlier. Though Andreas had served prison time for this, upon his release, Victoria returned to the farm with her children. The scandal made the family a subject of gossip and judgment, and many neighbors kept their distance. Victoria was known to have had another relationship with a local man, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, who claimed to be the father of young Josef. This fueled tensions in the village and gave outsiders yet another reason to look at the Grubers' farm with suspicion. In hindsight, These personal dramas would later become important in the investigation, as police considered whether the murders had been carried out by someone close to the family. Even without the scandal, Hinterkaifeck's environment was unsettling. The dense forest pressed close around the fields, and the house itself, with its creaking wooden beams and isolated barns, seemed to invite superstition. Winter in Bavaria was long and harsh, and in March, when the ground was still cold and the nights bitter, the farm felt more cut off from the world than ever. It was in this eerie setting that the stage was set for what would become a nightmare unlike anything the region had ever seen. Neighbors noticed the Grubers seemed more tense in those weeks, their interactions brief and guarded. Yet no one could have guessed that within days, the entire household would be slaughtered. Looking back, it is difficult to avoid the feeling that the family was marked, almost stalked, before their end. The footprints in the snow, the footsteps in the attic, the missing tools, all point to someone lurking nearby, watching the family closely. Whether that person lived among them in the village or was a stranger who had wandered into their lives, no one could say. What is certain is that Hinterkaifeck was not just an ordinary farm, it was a place where fear had already settled long before blood was spilled. March 31st, 1922, began like any other day in the Bavarian countryside. The sun rose over the frosted fields, melting the last patches of winter snow. But at Hinterkaifeck, the farm lay strangely silent. Smoke did not rise from the chimney, and no one appeared in the fields. Neighbors, who were accustomed to seeing Andreas or Victoria working outdoors, noticed the odd stillness, but assumed nothing was wrong. Yet as days passed, the silence deepened into concern. The Gruber family had not been seen in town, young Cecilia had missed school, and Victoria had failed to attend church choir, something she rarely skipped. By April 4th, villagers began to whisper. Concern turned to unease. The family's livestock had gone untended, their cows mooed desperately in the barn, and the dog barked furiously inside the stable. This neglect was not just unusual, it was alarming. Several neighbors decided to investigate. Among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man rumored to have fathered Victoria's youngest child. With two companions, he made his way through the quiet farmyard, pushing open the heavy wooden gate. At once, they were met with a sense of dread. The farm was too quiet, the air thick with something unspoken, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They entered the barn first. What they found would haunt them forever. Beneath a pile of hay and straw lay the bodies of Andreas, his wife, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia. The adults were stacked almost methodically, as if placed one atop another, and the little girl's body was partly visible, her face frozen in terror. All had suffered brutal blows to the head, inflicted by what investigators later believed was a mathook, an agricultural tool similar to an axe. The force had been so great that parts of their skulls were shattered. It was immediately clear this was no accident. Someone had killed them with chilling precision. The discovery was overwhelming. Lorenz, hardened though he was, recoiled in horror. But worse was yet to come. Searching the farmhouse, they found Maria Baumgartner, the maid, lying dead in her bed, her face covered by her sheets. And in the nursery, tiny Joseph, only 2 years old, lay lifeless in his cot, also bludgeoned. Every living member of the household had been murdered. 6 lives extinguished in one night, their bodies hidden only barely, as if the killer wanted them to be discovered. What chilled the men even more was the realization that the killer had likely stayed on the farm for days afterward. The animals had been fed, bread was baked in the kitchen oven, and meals had been eaten. Someone had been living in Hinterkaifeck after the murders, calmly carrying on daily life while corpses lay hidden just meters away. Word spread quickly through Groburn, and soon the quiet village was swarmed with police, officials, and horrified onlookers. In an era before modern crime scene preservation, many people trampled through the farmhouse, contaminating evidence that might have been crucial. Even so, the brutality of the crime was impossible to ignore. Investigators noted the strange methodical placement of the bodies, and the absence of theft. Money and valuables remained untouched. The motive, it seemed, was not robbery. It was something far darker. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was the condition of young Cecilia, the 7-year-old. Unlike the others, she appeared to have lived for several hours after the initial attack. Her body bore signs of distress. Tufts of her hair had been ripped out, suggesting she had lain conscious, terrified, pulling her hair in agony before she died. This detail painted the crime in an even more horrifying light. Whoever had killed the family had done so with cold, remorseless violence, leaving a child to suffer before finally succumbing. Investigators scoured the farm for clues. They discovered the same set of footprints Andreas had reported earlier, leading toward the house but not away from it. There was evidence the killer had used the family's attic, perhaps hiding there before the murders. The weapon, the mattock, was missing, and the barn itself showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting the family had been lured inside willingly, perhaps by someone they knew. Each discovery deepened the mystery rather than solving it. As bodies were carried out, the villagers stood in stunned silence. Hinterkaifeck was no longer just a lonely farm. It had become a crime scene that felt more like the setting of a nightmare. People whispered that the place was cursed, that the Grubers had been punished for their sins. Others feared a madman was lurking in the woods, ready to strike again. The sheer brutality of the killings was unlike anything they had ever known, and fear spread like wildfire. For weeks, villagers locked their doors at night and eyed their neighbors with suspicion. The funeral drew a crowd from across Bavaria. 6 coffins, lowered into the ground side by side, symbolized the end of the Gruber family and their new maid's short life on the farm. Yet there was no peace to be found. The mystery of who had killed them and why hung heavy in the air. Investigators promised justice, but the silence of the forest seemed to mock them. Hinterkaifeck, once just an isolated farmhouse, had become synonymous with horror. The discovery of the 6 bodies at Hinterkaifeck sent shockwaves not only through Groburn, but across all of Bavaria. The local police force, overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and strangeness of the case, quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond a simple murder. Officers from nearby towns, including Munich, were brought in to assist. Yet even from the very beginning, the investigation was hampered by mistakes, confusion, and a lack of proper forensic methods in 1922. When detectives first arrived at the farm, they found the scene in chaos. Dozens of neighbors had already trampled through the barn and farmhouse, curious and horrified, contaminating what could have been vital evidence. The sheer number of footprints, human and animal, made it nearly impossible to separate the killer's tracks from those of onlookers. Moreover, some of the villagers had moved objects and even uncovered the bodies themselves before investigators could document the scene. This critical loss of control meant that the investigation started on uneven ground. Still, police pressed forward. The leading theory at first was robbery. After all, in the years following World War I, rural Bavaria was struggling economically, and crimes of desperation were not uncommon. But this idea quickly fell apart. Cash was found inside the house, untouched. Valuables remained in place. If the motive had been theft, why leave behind everything of worth? Investigators realized they were dealing with a different kind of killer, one whose motive lay in rage, revenge, or something even more personal. Suspicion initially fell on vagrants and traveling workers. The farm's location, isolated and surrounded by forests, made it a tempting target for drifters. Police questioned numerous itinerants and travelers, but no solid connections could be made. The brutality of the murders seemed excessive for a mere opportunistic crime. This was something else. Attention soon turned inward, toward those connected to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had long been disliked in the community. He was known as a harsh man, stern and difficult, with rumors swirling about his temper. More disturbingly, villagers whispered about the family's dark secret, allegations that Andreas and Victoria Heibel had an incestuous relationship. In fact, court records from years earlier confirmed that Andreas had once been charged with incest, though he served only a brief prison sentence. The scandal left a deep mark, and Victoria's youngest child, Josef, was widely believed to be Andreas's son, rather than the product of her relationship with Lorenz Schlittenbauer. This revelation cast suspicion in new directions. If Josef was indeed Andreas's son, then who might have had a reason to kill the child and the family? Many in the village speculated that Lorenz himself had motive. Lorenz had been romantically involved with Victoria and may have been Josef's father. He had even reportedly offered to marry her, but Andreas forbade it. When Lorenz entered the farm and discovered the bodies, villagers noticed that he appeared oddly calm, even practical, tending to animals and moving about as if unfazed. Some interpreted this behavior as guilt. Others argued he was simply a man accustomed to hardship, doing what was necessary in the moment. Police interrogated Lorenz repeatedly. His inconsistent statements and strange behavior added to suspicions. At one point, he admitted to having keys to the farm, though he later changed his story. He was familiar with the property, and some speculated he might have lured the family into the barn one by one, killing them as they arrived. But despite the suspicions, no physical evidence ever tied him to the crime, and without modern forensic tools, investigators could only speculate. Lorenz was eventually released, though he remained a central figure in rumors for the rest of his life. Beyond Lorenz, investigators explored other leads. The family had reportedly been experiencing strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the murders. Footprints in the snow leading to the farm but not away, the sound of footsteps in the attic, and Andreas finding a strange newspaper on the property that no one in the family had purchased. These details painted a haunting picture. Someone had been watching the Grubers, perhaps even living in their attic, waiting for the right moment to strike. Police searched the attic but found little more than disturbed hay and vague signs of habitation. Whether the killer had hidden there before the murders remained an open question, but the idea of an unseen intruder fed the legend of the case. Investigators also considered local grudges. The Grubers were not well liked in the community. Andreas, especially, had made enemies through land disputes and his domineering personality. Could one of those enemies have finally snapped? Police questioned numerous villagers, but no solid evidence emerged. The murders seemed too carefully executed, too merciless to have been the work of a simple feud. The investigation dragged on for weeks, then months. Forensic experts of the time tried to study the wounds, confirming that a mattock, a common farm tool, had been the murder weapon. But the weapon itself could not be found. Later, in a twist, it was discovered hidden in the farm's machinery shed during renovations years afterwards, a chilling reminder of how close the weapon had been all along. But by then, the trail had gone cold. As the weeks passed, the police faced mounting pressure. The community demanded answers, and newspapers across Germany carried sensational headlines about the Hinterkaifeck murders. Amateur detectives, psychics, and journalists all descended upon the small village, offering wild theories. The farmhouse became a macabre attraction, with people traveling miles to see the site where 6 lives had been brutally ended. For investigators, the constant speculation only made their work harder. In time, the official inquiry slowed, then stalled. With no arrests, no confessions, and no concrete evidence, the case was shelved. For the villagers of Groburn, the horror never faded. They locked their doors at night, whispered about ghosts haunting the farm, and eyed one another with suspicion. The idea that the killer might be someone they knew, someone still walking among them, was perhaps the most terrifying thought of all. The farmhouse itself stood for years as a grim monument to the crime. Eventually, it was demolished in the 1920s, but the land remained scarred by the memory of what had happened there. Investigators would return to the case again and again over the decades, re-examining old evidence, chasing new leads, but always reaching the same dead end. Hinterkaifeck had become not just a crime scene, but a riddle, one that refused to give up its secrets. As the investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders stretched on without resolution, suspicion turned to those closest to the Gruber family. For the police and villagers alike, the sheer brutality of the killings suggested something more personal than a random act of violence. Someone had a reason, whether born of hatred, jealousy, or revenge, and that reason might lie hidden in the tangled lives of the victims. The most obvious suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies. Lorenz's connection to the family was complicated, to say the least. Years before, he had been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel, Andreas and Cecilia's daughter. Victoria had even given birth to a child, Joseph, whose paternity was never clear. Many villagers whispered that Lorenz was the father, though Andreas, the strict patriarch, was rumored to have forbidden their marriage. Others claimed that Andreas himself was Joseph's father, the product of an incestuous relationship that had already landed him in jail once. These rumors painted a disturbing picture. Lorenz had loved Victoria, been pushed aside by Andreas, and perhaps resented being denied a role in Joseph's life. When investigators questioned him, Lorenz's answers often seemed contradictory. At one point, he admitted he had keys to the farmhouse, though he later claimed he had lost them. Villagers also found his demeanor suspicious. On the day he discovered the bodies, he reportedly moved about the crime scene with unsettling composure, even tending to the farm animals and unlocking doors. Some said he seemed too comfortable at the farm, as if he had been there many times before. Police interrogated Lorenz repeatedly, and though he denied any involvement, suspicions lingered. Many believed he had the motive, the knowledge of the property, and the opportunity to commit the crime. Yet without hard evidence, the case against him could never be proven. Lorenz lived under the cloud of suspicion for the rest of his life, to Victoria herself. Though she was one of the victims, her complicated personal life became a focal point. Victoria was known to be a devout member of her church choir, but behind closed doors, her relationship with her father Andreas was the subject of scandal. Years earlier, Andreas had served prison time for incest with Victoria, though after his release, it appeared the relationship continued. If Joseph was indeed his child, as many suspected, it meant the abuse had never stopped. This revelation gave rise to a sinister theory. Perhaps someone killed the Gruber family to put an end to Andreas's crimes. A vigilante, disgusted by the incest and abuse, could have exacted justice in the most brutal way possible. The idea was horrifying, yet it resonated with many who despised Andreas. He was not a beloved figure in Groburn. Known for his harshness and cruelty, Andreas had few friends and plenty of enemies. Could one of those enemies have finally snapped? Police also considered the possibility of a family feud turned deadly. The Grubers had land disputes with neighbors, and rural Bavaria in the early 20th century was rife with tensions over property, inheritance, and money. The farm itself was a valuable asset. Was it possible that greed had fueled the massacre? Yet, once again, the untouched valuables inside the farmhouse made robbery or land theft seem unlikely as the sole motive. Then came the theory of strangers. Investigators explored the idea that vagrants, deserters from the war, or traveling criminals had targeted the farm. This theory seemed plausible in some respects. After all, the farm was remote and vulnerable. But the level of brutality, combined with the eerie signs that someone may have been watching the family beforehand, suggested something more intimate. Why linger on the farm after the murders, tending to animals and feeding them, unless the killer had a strange attachment to the property or people? Another bizarre element was the case of the maid Maria Baumgartner. She had arrived at the farm just hours before the murders to replace a previous maid who had quit due to the eerie atmosphere and her fears of the Gruber household. Maria was killed in her bed, barely having settled into her new home. For some, Schiemer was overkill, a necessary act only if the killer wanted to eliminate all witnesses. But others wondered, had she unknowingly seen or heard something in her first night that sealed her fate? Over the years, other suspects emerged. In the 1950s, investigators revisited the case and questioned two brothers who had served in the military and were rumored to have confessed to the murders while drunk. But their confessions were vague, inconsistent, and ultimately dismissed. Others suggested that the killer may have been a farmhand who once worked at Hinterkaifeck and returned to settle old grievances. The scandalous and salacious details kept fueling speculation. The incest, the possible illegitimate child, the disputes with neighbors, and the odd behavior of Lorenz Schlittenbauer all created a storm of theories but no clarity. The lack of forensic technology in 1922 meant that the physical evidence that might have solved the case, a fingerprint, a trace of blood, a weapon, was either lost or overlooked. The public, however, was not deterred by the lack of answers. Newspapers sensationalized the story, painting Andreas as a cruel patriarch, Victoria as a tragic victim of abuse, and Lorenz as a spurned lover turned possible murderer. Each article added fuel to the fire, creating an atmosphere where the line between fact and rumor blurred. The case was not just a murder investigation. It was a scandal that exposed the darkest corners of rural life in post-war Germany. For the villagers of Grobern, the aftermath was chilling. They looked at one another with suspicion, wondering if the killer walked among them. Parents warned their children not to wander near the site of the farm. Some claimed the land was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of the Gruber family. And always the rumors continued, about Lorenz, about Andreas, about the strange noises in the attic that hinted at someone hiding there long before the murders. The Hinterkaifeck murders were no longer just a crime. They had become a legend, a story whispered in kitchens and taverns, a symbol of fear and secrecy. And yet, for all the speculation, the identity of the killer remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of scandal, secrets, and suspicion. The investigation pressed on, but every new lead seemed to circle back to the same frustrating conclusion. Too many suspects, too many motives, and not enough evidence. Hinterkaifeck was a puzzle, and the pieces refused to fit together. As the years turned into decades, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck refused to fade. Instead, it grew larger, becoming one of Germany's most enduring unsolved cases. The brutality of the crime, the strange details surrounding it, and the absence of a definitive suspect created fertile ground for endless theories. Every generation that encountered the story added its own interpretation, its own suspicion, its own obsession with who the killer might have been and why they had committed such an atrocity. One of the earliest and most persistent theories remained focused on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor. Even long after his death in 1941, many continued to believe that he had the strongest motive. His relationship with Victoria Gabriel, his rumored paternity of Josef, and his allegedly cold and calculated behavior when discovering the bodies all painted him as the most likely culprit. Supporters of this theory argued that Lorenz had been humiliated by Victoria's rejection, embittered by Andreas's control over her and enraged at being denied a relationship with the boy he believed to be his son. Killing the family could have been an act of both revenge and release. Yet others pointed out flaws in this theory. Lawrence was not a young man at the time of the murders, and he suffered from health issues. Could he really have carried out such a brutal massacre, wielding a heavy mattock and subduing 6 people, including strong adults, in rapid succession? And if he had, why would he remain in the community afterward, living out the rest of his life under the watchful eye of suspicious neighbors? Most killers, some argued, would have fled, not stayed. Another enduring theory revolved around the possibility of a serial killer or drifter. Germany in the early 1920s was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I. Displaced veterans, criminals, and the homeless wandered the countryside. Perhaps someone passing through Groburn had stumbled upon the remote farm, seen an opportunity, and struck. But this explanation did not sit well with many. A transient killer would have likely taken valuables or left chaos in their wake. Instead, the Hinterkaifeck murders seemed strangely meticulous. The killer used the family's own farm tools, arranged the bodies neatly in the barn, and lingered afterward, feeding the animals and eating meals in the kitchen. This did not feel like the work of a random drifter. Some theorists leaned heavily into the supernatural. For the villagers of Groburn, already steeped in folklore and superstition, it was tempting to imagine the murders as the work of a curse or even a restless spirit. The sounds in the attic before the murders, the footsteps, the misplaced objects, were interpreted by some as signs of haunting. Could it have been that the Grubers were doomed by something otherworldly? Rational minds dismissed these stories as fear-driven imagination, yet the folklore endured. To this day, some locals speak of Hinterkaifeck as if it were a cursed place. More modern investigators proposed psychological explanations. The incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria cast a shadow over the entire case. Some theorists speculated that one of the victims themselves had finally snapped. Could Victoria, long trapped under her father's dominance, have lashed out in rage, killing him and others in a tragic explosion of violence, only to be overpowered in the end? Could Cecilia, the teenage girl, have witnessed something unspeakable and been silenced? Though chilling, such theories lacked evidence, but they reflected the way people tried to grapple with the darkness that seemed to hang over the family. One of the most debated aspects of the case is the question of premeditation. Many investigators believe the killer had lived in the attic or hidden near the property in the days before the murders. Strange occurrences, footsteps heard in the ceiling, objects vanishing, an unfamiliar newspaper found on the kitchen table suggested someone had infiltrated the farmhouse before the attack. If true, this meant the murders were not spontaneous but carefully planned. Some theorists imagine a stalker, someone obsessed with Victoria or resentful of Andreas, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Over the decades, law enforcement revisited the case several times. In the 1950s, detectives interviewed surviving villagers and family members, compiling hundreds of pages of testimony. They even exhumed the victims' skulls, hoping modern techniques might yield clues. Tragically, those skulls were later lost during the chaos of World War II, eliminating any chance of future forensic examination. The lost evidence became yet another haunting chapter in a story already steeped in mystery. The theories also stretched into the realm of organized crime or conspiracy. Some suggested that the Grubers had stumbled on something they weren't meant to see: illegal dealings, smuggling, or political secrets in the turbulent post-war years. According to this view, the family had been silenced by outsiders, explaining the thoroughness of the killings. Yet again, there was no concrete evidence, only speculation. The story has also captured the imagination of criminologists and true crime enthusiasts far beyond Germany. Modern psychological profiling has been applied retroactively, with some experts concluding the killer was likely male, familiar with the farm, and deeply motivated by personal rage. Others argue the meticulousness of the crime indicates a cool, calculated mind rather than a crime of passion. But with so little physical evidence preserved, such profiles remain educated guesses. In recent years, DNA testing has been proposed, with descendants of suspects suggested for comparison. However, the loss of critical evidence, especially the victim's skulls and other biological material, means the possibility of a definitive resolution is slim. Each time the case is revisited, the same questions arise and the same answers remain elusive. The Hinterkaifeck murders have thus become more than a crime. They are a mirror reflecting the fears, suspicions, and obsessions of those who study them. Every theory says as much about the people proposing it as it does about the events themselves. For some, Lawrence Schlittenbauer remains the villain. For others, it is Andreas's cruelty that doomed his family. Still others cling to the idea of a nameless outsider who came, killed, and vanished. And so the theories multiply, each plausible, each flawed, none conclusive. Hinterkaifeck sits at the intersection of fact and legend, a place where history and folklore blur. The farm itself is long gone, demolished in the 1920s after becoming a macabre tourist attraction. But the story endures, whispered and retold, haunting the imagination of all who hear it. More than a century has passed since the murders on that lonely Bavarian farmstead, yet the Hinterkaifeck case endures as one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Unlike many forgotten tragedies of the past, this story refuses to fade. Instead, it lingers, like the phantom footsteps in the Gruber's attic, etched into Germany's collective memory and whispered in true crime circles around the world. Part of its endurance comes from the sheer horror of the details. A remote farmhouse, a family slaughtered with a farm tool, bodies stacked neatly in a barn, and a killer who lingered, eating meals and tending livestock as though nothing had happened. These images refuse to be forgotten. They strike at something primal in the human imagination, the terror of invasion, the fear of betrayal, the vulnerability of home itself. Hinterkaifeck is not just a crime, it is a nightmare given form. The case also endures because of its timing in history. The murders occurred in 1922, a moment when Germany was fractured by war, poverty, and political upheaval. In many ways, Hinterkaifeck became a symbol of that chaotic era, where violence could erupt anywhere, even in the most isolated corners of the countryside. For villagers living in rural Bavaria, the crime shattered illusions of safety. If such horror could strike the Grubers, it could strike anyone. Generational retellings have further cemented the mystery's grip. For decades, locals shared the tale in hushed voices, passing down details like folklore. Parents warned children not to wander the woods at night. Old men at taverns speculated about Lorenz Schlittenbauer or whispered about ghosts haunting the ruins of the farm. With each telling, the story blurred the line between fact and legend, until Hinterkaifeck existed not only as a crime, but as a cultural myth. In the modern era, the case found new life thanks to the rise of true crime media. Documentaries, books, podcasts, and YouTube channels have all explored the murders, dissecting every theory, every scrap of evidence. The internet has allowed amateur sleuths worldwide to debate the case as if it happened yesterday. Forums fill with arguments over suspects, timelines, and forensic possibilities. Some hope that new technology, DNA, genealogical databases, advanced profiling might still crack the case. Others believe too much evidence has been lost to time, making closure impossible. What keeps the story alive is not just the question of who killed the Grubers, but why. If it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, was it jealousy, revenge, or cold practicality? If it was a drifter, what drove them to linger and live in the farmhouse afterward? If it was someone within the family, what dark secrets led to such a massacre? Each possibility forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, that cruelty can hide behind the mask of neighborliness, that violence can spring from hidden family sins, and that sometimes justice never comes. The physical site of Hinterkaifeck no longer exists. The farmhouse was demolished in 1923 after becoming a grim attraction for morbid tourists. Today, the land is quiet farmland once more. Yet memorials mark the site, and visitors still come to pay respects. Some lay flowers at the cross erected in memory of the victims. Others simply stand in silence, listening to the wind and imagining the echoes of that fateful March night. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck extends far beyond Germany. Criminologists study it as a case that illustrates the challenges of early forensic work. Psychologists analyze it as an example of mass fascination with horror. Writers and filmmakers draw on it for inspiration, weaving echoes of the murders into fiction. It has become more than a crime. It is a touchstone for how we understand violence, secrecy, and unsolved mysteries. And yet, despite all the theories and research, the case remains unsolved. No arrest, no trial, no confession ever brought closure. For some, this is the most chilling fact of all, that someone committed one of the most horrific crimes in German history and vanished into the fabric of time, unpunished, unexposed. It reminds us that history is full of shadows, that truth is not always attainable, and that evil sometimes escapes justice. Perhaps this is why Hinterkaifeck endures, because it refuses to give us answers. Unlike stories where justice is served and order is restored, Hinterkaifeck leaves us unsettled, forced to live with ambiguity. We want the world to be logical, crimes to be solved, killers to be unmasked. But Hinterkaifeck denies us that comfort. It whispers instead that some mysteries are eternal. Even so, the victims are not forgotten. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, the younger Cecilia, little Joseph, and even the maid, Maria, ordinary people whose lives ended in extraordinary horror, are remembered through every retelling. In speaking their names, in pondering their fate, we honor them, even if justice never came. The enduring mystery of Hinterkaifeck is, in the end, a reflection of ourselves, our hunger for answers, our fascination with darkness, our fear of the unknown, and our hope that even in tragedy, stories can teach us something about humanity. Whether the killer was a neighbor, a stranger, or someone forever lost to history, the murders of 1922 remain an echo across time, reminding us that some doors, once opened, never truly close.